A new chapter of the trade war between the US and China has been opened, the two largest superpowers on Earth. Last week, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that gave him power to control the US trade, and thus he put Huawei, one of the global smartphone leaders, on the American government's blacklist. Now, no US company can trade with a Chinese company without first obtaining government authorization. The scenario is already very complicated to begin with. Google, the company that owns the Android operating system, which is the default system of the vast majority of smartphones all around the world, including Huawei, was forced to comply with the White House orders. Thus, Google had announced that Huawei phones would no longer have updates to the Android operating system and Google applications such as YouTube, Gmail, and Google Maps. Intel, the largest microchip company in the world, also one of Huawei's suppliers, had also announced that it had cut ties with the Chinese company following orders from DC. The impact only creates a deeper scar in the trade war between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, and there's no sign of this ever dying down soon. Both powers have imposed tariffs of between 15 and 25%, making their products cost billions of dollars more in the market. The White House presidential veto is the new extreme that no administration had ever went to before in this context. DC never vetoed Samsung or Nokia the way that it has done to Huawei. Trump stated that Huawei, who has strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party, is a Trojan horse and a critical national security threat. Other parties believe that Trump has taken this step to prevent Apple from bleeding to death as a result of Huawei's explosive growth in recent years. A couple of weeks ago, Huawei surpassed Apple in the number of sales of smartphones, while Apple sees its profits and unit sales of iPhones decrease at every consecutive quarter. Today, we will see the consequences of this new declaration of war within the biggest trade dispute of the last decades. Let's begin. About 1 billion users will be affected by the abrupt decision from the White House to ban Huawei from freely working with US companies. The repercussions of this action could go very deep, and it could even be considered as an act of aggression towards China, according to some. Huawei was virtually unknown just a decade ago. Today, it has become a highly respected company in its field. The US accuses Beijing, stating that Huawei has stolen American and European technology. However, there are contradictory reports from both sides. But the purpose of this video is not to judge whether or not China is stealing technology, because both parties are accused of espionage and theft of patents. What is clear is that Huawei has expanded to every corner of the globe, as Apple once did with its iPhone and computers. China has gradually become a very rich economic giant with close to a market of 1.3 billion potential customers. But unlike Europe and the US, China is an authoritarian regime and a heavily censored country where a large majority of young people never knew the atrocities such as the massacre of Tiananmen Square and the concentration camps in eastern China where thousands of Muslims are executed by orders from Beijing. China is a country where censorship and control of the media prevail, and in that sense, when Google tried to expand in the country in the 2000s, it had achieved it. But the Chinese regime challenged its expansion. Google announced that it was being subjected to espionage and intimidation by Beijing, which was trying to take advantage of its computer systems. The result? Google and all its entities were blocked from mainland China, and to this day, it still remains the case. Neither Google, nor YouTube, nor any affiliate companies operate in the largest market in the world, and Google was not the only victim. There are thousands of companies and websites banned by the Chinese government, which is known as the Great Firewall of China. In short, Beijing sets its conditions for anyone who wants to enter China, and sometimes the price to pay is espionage and censorship of their technologies. Neither Facebook nor any other social networks, such as WhatsApp, are allowed in China. For a long time, China has been an important market for Apple, and could not enjoy losing access to such a valuable market, and therefore, it was willing to sacrifice certain functionalities. Apple began to see their profits and revenues decrease in China, partly due to the growth of the Chinese company Huawei, which is heavily promoted by the Chinese government in the country and abroad. The ongoing trade war between the US and China was originally caused by Trump with the tariffs that he imposed on China on its exports. Trump's executive power gives him the power of commerce, and under the same power, he has forced American companies to cut ties with Huawei under the excuse of national security. Google, as the company it is, has no interest in cutting ties with one of its major trading partners, Huawei. But in this case, Google has to abide by the presidential order from the White House. The same goes for companies such as Intel, Facebook, and Microsoft. These companies will be forced to cut off any relationship with Huawei, and as a result, the company could potentially be paralyzed, since a large part of its components come from American companies such as Intel and Microsoft. In the first instance, for example, their latest smartphones will no longer utilize Android, and American companies such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube will no longer be available. In the case of their laptops, for example, Microsoft will be forced to not provide more assistance to Huawei's operating system, i.e. Windows, and it will also be left without the logistical support of their microchip producer, in this case, Intel. In the case of chips, without Intel, Huawei is a bit paralyzed, and in fact, if they want to find another alternative, it would be AMD. The problem is, AMD is also American. Huawei, as well as hundreds of millions of users and hundreds of other companies, have been paralyzed due to Trump's orders, and many would consider this as an attack on free trade and the free market. In a way, it is true that China is an authoritarian power that promotes censorship, and we could even say that they promote espionage. But the US is not much better to give moral lessons when it is the #1 country that spy on the world. That being said, its censorship is also evident when dealing with revealed state matters, as was the case with the Australian journalist Julian Assange. With the latest decision from the White House, Huawei is paralyzed for the short to medium term, but as a matter of fact, Huawei was already working on developing its own operating system because it already foresaw that something like this could happen. The problem, though, is not just the operating system, it is also the electrical components that it uses, as well as other hardware and software that is mostly in the hands of American companies. Huawei will have to develop its own operating system, apart from looking for different software and hardware alternatives to American companies. Huawei's alternatives as a leader in Chinese technology is to entirely develop every single component and only using its own technology. So in other words, it has to stop relying on components or systems that are made in the US. But that, in the short term, is highly unlikely. Another option would be to try to find non-American suppliers such as South Korea's Samsung or European technology. It is very realistic to say that the consequence of this economic embargo on Huawei will greatly limit its growth projection. The company planned to dethrone Samsung this year as the company with the highest number of sales, but having to develop a new operating system and other components will impact the time that it will take for Huawei to achieve their goals. Now think of the actual impact this has on consumers. Would you use a phone that couldn't use WhatsApp, Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter, and Gmail? Probably not, unless you are willing to give up the vast majority of social networks. The entrance of Huawei to the US blacklist is one of the latest actions in order to stop Huawei's expansion. But this affects much more than just smartphones. It also affects new data technology such as 5G, which has become a geopolitical game all around the world. In Europe, Huawei has also been under attack for their development of 5G. The US government has already threatened its allies with a stop of intelligence if governments accept Huawei-developed 5G technology in their country. Some governments, such as Australia and New Zealand, have already given in to that pressure. But recently, London had decided to allow Huawei to develop the 5G networks, evidently under the surveillance of the British government. That being said, Washington has stated that it would limit its intelligence with London. But this will also be a loss for the US, since to stop sharing secret information with London will also be harmful, considering the geographic importance of Britain to filter information between Russia, the European Union, and the US. Germany has also allowed Huawei to develop the 5G network. Recently, Chancellor Merkel came to the defense of Huawei in view of Trump's executive order. Germany has stated that the current trade war between the US and China is also harming European consumers. After failed attempts at negotiations, China is seeing its complicated position. The United States has many other options on the table. China could very well do the same to the US by banning Apple, which would undoubtedly be an act of retaliation for leaving Huawei without Google and Intel's technical support. It is clear that Huawei will be affected in the medium to long term, reducing their exponential growth that they have experienced recently. Trump's executive order will evidently discourage users from buying Huawei products, since in the future they may not have access to Google apps and even Facebook or WhatsApp. And even for laptops, many will be discouraged due to the lack of support from Intel chips, the Windows operating system, and Adobe programs. Both of these countries depend a lot on each other, but China depends on the US slightly more than the other way around in terms of exports. China is a country that exports a lot to the US. 20% of China's exports go to American territory, but the US exports only 10% to China. In fact, Mexico is its main commercial partner. On the other hand, Trump wants to reduce the commercial balance of the US, a country that traditionally imports more than it exports, especially from China, with close to 25% of imports coming from the Asian country. The US has a trade deficit of nearly $1 trillion, the largest deficit on Earth. Trump has been trying to penalize the consumption of Chinese imports, imposing them with tariffs of between 15 to 25%, in order to reduce the American consumption of these products. Based on the tariffs, more than $70 billion have been collected by the Treasury Department. Trump has boasted that the country has received billions of dollars from China thanks to taxes, but this is incorrect. A part of the income from these taxes have been paid by American citizens who have bought or consumed Chinese products. Therefore, the trade war between the two largest world powers and between their largest tech companies has already claimed its first victims. At the moment, if you already have a Huawei, the product is still usable. But in the future, these products may not have security updates from Google, and even though Huawei has already ensured system updates, at the moment, we don't know what will happen to the Play Store. For those who are thinking of buying a Huawei smartphone in the future, you will have to know that they might not have an updated operating system like Android, and you may not have access to the Google Play Store to download applications. Huawei has stated that it will replace Android with their own operating system, but at the moment, it is still being developed. And for now, we don't know what capacities it will have, and we don't know if we can access Google applications such as Maps, YouTube, and Gmail. Massively used applications such as Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram may also not be present. Thus, a new chapter of the trade war has been opened, and we will have to wait and see for what will happen next. So what do you think of the trade war at this point? Do you think it was reasonable for Trump to block Huawei from working with American companies? Or do you think this was just an attempt to save Apple? I hope you liked this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this every single week. See you next time.